Well, it's hard to believe that the year is almost over, a year dominated by an unprecedented virus and a global pandemic. There has been some good news, of course, recently around the vaccine rollout across Canada. But since December started, Ontario has had a surge in new cases this past week with multiple days of more than 2,000 cases reported. And the country, of course, is in the throes of the second wave. Joining us now for more is Raywat Deonandan. He's an epidemiologist and associate professor from the University of Ottawa, and has been good enough to join us now on the line for more. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Of course, with the end of the year so near, it's tough to not be reflective of this past year. And I'm wondering, when you think back to March and the early days of this pandemic, did you think then that we might one day be in a situation like we are today?
I thought it was possible. I didn't think it was likely, though, because I thought we had a good plan in front of us. What I didn't realize was we actually didn't have any plan. We sort of making this up as we went along. So originally, the epidemiologists figured that we had, we would wait out the first wave with these hard suppression techniques, the hard lockdown. Then as the summer came and gave us a bit of a breathing space, we'd be able to deploy some more promising long-term tools like the testing, the tracing, and the isolation, and prepare really well for school. That way we could dance, as the term was. We hammered down and we danced until the vaccine came. But as one of my colleagues said, you can only dance if you know the steps, and somehow we lost the step, and the dance became just tolerating another huge wave.
How did that happen? How did we forget the steps? What went wrong exactly?
Well, in my opinion, we sort of squandered the summer, at least in Ontario. I don't want to point too many fingers towards our leaders, because frankly, I could not have done a better job, But there are some things we could have done that were fairly clear. One was spend the summer to experiment a bit more on how to open schools safely. We could have spent some time on summer classes to figure out ventilation issues and so forth. We could have started planning for school openings earlier. We could have spent a lot more money on smaller class sizes and better ventilation, etc. We could have spent a lot more resources on contact tracing and testing. The way the Asian countries have done it, and they have shown us, they gave us a great blueprint, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, for how to, quote-unquote, live with this virus. That is just really good contact tracing and use of rapid tests. So we failed on those fronts.
What do you think our handling of this pandemic perhaps suggests around our societal priorities, especially, when you make that comparison to other countries?
Well, there is definitely a discussion to be had about the role of economy in the context of health. So does health exist to service the wherewithal of wealth, or does economy exist to service better well-being? I would argue the latter, but there seems to be a feeling that if you make everyone economically healthy, then that sort of takes care of itself. That's a values question. It's not for me to answer, but there's at least something to be had there in terms of exploring Canadian values.
How would you assess how well communication took place, whether that was from medical health experts, politicians, or any other leaders of authority to the general public, and I suppose vice versa?
I think this is going to be one of the biggest things we dissect in the coming years, if not decades. So when we look back at SARS-1, some of the lessons that we wrote down that we should definitely plan for the future pandemic was transparent, comprehensive communication. We did not anticipate having to overcome enormous amounts of misinformation and disinformation, having to convince people that a real thing was a real thing. Right? So in that sense, we have failed the communications front. There is a lack of clarity, very consistently so. There is, some of our leaders said some strange things that were not followed up with some clarification. For example, some comments in the summer about false positives, which were not particularly accurate. And then the follow-up was not as loudly amplified. So that kind of slip-up was jumped upon by the anti-COVID or the COVID denial crowd and amplified a wrong message. So we can definitely do a better job around communication.
Raywat, you alluded to the trouble with perhaps trying to have some sort of balance in the wake of a pandemic like this, and in light of an unprecedented virus, trying to balance something like healthcare and the economy as we continue to navigate through lockdowns and the rest of the province all of Ontario continues to grapple with situations in specific communities. How would you assess the effectiveness of the ways these lockdowns have taken place and continue to take place?
The original one, I think, worked really well. Mind you, back then we didn't know a whole lot about this disease. It made sense to essentially hide in our houses until it went away, which is the ancient technique we've been using since the plague of Justinian, really. So that worked fine. Now that we know a bit more about it, it makes sense, in my mind, to apply a bit more nuanced approach, so a targeted regional lockdowns and economic restrictions and so forth. Remember, we do this as a disincentives for human behavior. This is all about preventing people from interacting with each other. We wouldn't have to do these things if people could voluntarily self-restrict or were given opportunities to engage in other kinds of activities. For example, if you can't go to school, well, then you have homeschooling, right? So in that sense, we've sort of failed at the citizen level. People don't seem to understand that we do have an individual responsibility to limit our exposures. Having said all that, I think overall we're doing better than many could have done, and we're doing worse than some. So I look down at New Zealand. I'm really envious. You know, they acted early, they acted hard, they trusted their leaders, and they ranked health above economy. And I kind of wish we had done that.
As you know, I mean, these numbers are staggering. As I mentioned off the top, this week, multiple days across Ontario with more than 2,000 cases a day reported. I'm curious how you feel around public sentiment towards the communication we've been given on that front. Do you find that shock factor whenever we pass a certain threshold or milestone can make it seem less scary once you get used to X amount of cases, and then a few days later, that seems like the status quo?
Yeah, you can normalize anything. You can normalize any kind of horror, as we learned from, decades of war. So what do you do about this? I think one thing we do is we use media to our benefit and to show the people the insides of overrun hospitals and explain what the cost really is. It isn't necessarily death, it's suffering. It isn't necessarily suffering by COVID, it's suffering by delayed cancer screenings, for example, which lead to greater suffering down the road. It's delayed elective surgeries, which means people can't get back to work. It's your loved ones dying without the presence of their loved ones with them. So the nature of the human horror has not been adequately expressed if we just talk about numbers without context.
The hope of a return to normalcy is paramount when we look into the new year, into 2021, whenever that may be. But how do you think 2020 will be remembered among the medical community?
Wow. I think it'll be remembered as the year of heroism of our frontline healthcare workers, absolutely. It'll be remembered at the time when the public, for the most part, understood the heroism of healthcare providers. It'll be understood at the time when our dwindling ICU and hospital bed capacity really came to bite us in the foot. We've been known for some time we don't have good capacity compared to other OECD nations. This is a wake-up call to fix that. And also it was a signal by the world to say, prepare for future public health and natural disasters because they're coming. So this has been, an opportunity to prepare, and hopefully we take that on board and do the right investments going forward.
It's so interesting you say that. When you say wake-up call, I wonder, and I know this may sound like a bit of a strange question, but do you think there's a concern that if and when we do have that return to quote-unquote normalcy, that can be a concern in itself, that we might, as a society, be too quick to forget what happens when we don't prioritize healthcare or don't learn from whatever mistakes we can look back on?
The one example I keep going to is 9/11. So they always said after 9/11 the world changed, and it did for a number of years. And some of the lingering security changes we made after 9/11 still exist today, taking off your shoes at the airport and going through multiple ID screenings. But a lot of the other ones kind of fall by the wayside. So I anticipate we will be extra vigilant for the same number of years, like 5 years or so later, and then some of the things will fall by the wayside. I'm hoping government does not do that we invest in good global disease surveillance, in a good plan for pandemic response, particularly a communications plan, and continue investing in vaccine development platforms, because as we learned, that was ultimately our salvation. And the reason we got a vaccine so quickly, a number of reasons, but the main one was money. We spent a lot of money on this. So we know that there are levers government can pull to hasten the path out of this kind of emergency, and I think that will not be forgotten.
Spotlight, of course, has been on the vaccine rollout over the course of these last couple of weeks, and I suppose rightly so, but what will you be watching for on top of that as we head into 2021?
Wow, that's a tough one. I'll be watching for what we learned as a society and as a profession. I'll be looking for, of course, specifically who's getting the vaccine, the equity issues surrounding it. What does this look at the global scale? And again, how can we plan to prevent this kind of thing happening again? Because it will happen again. Diseases aren't going away. Pandemics are coming again. The question is, can we prevent the next one from being as disruptive?
Raywat, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You take care and happy holidays.
Bye.
That is Raywat Deonandan, who's an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa.